I am Dr. Shakti and let's discuss about chemical regulation of respiration. So we can take a look at the questions here. Peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to what? Chemoreceptors are located in which area? So what is a chemoreceptor? Where is it located? How does it act? So these are some basic questions we need to ask ourselves. You can see over here the carotid body is located here at the bifurcation. Okay, so this is the common carotid artery, and at its bifurcation you can see the presence of your carotid body. You have the aortic bodies at the arch of aorta. So that is your chemoreceptors. Your carotid body and aortic bodies are your chemoreceptors. And something that might confuse you is your carotid and aortic sinus. So a sinus over there in the carotid and the aortic region, that is a baroreceptor. Okay, so this is something that students commonly confuse with each other. So chemoreceptor, carotid body, aortic body, and baroreceptor, carotid and aortic sinus. So if you take a magnified view of it, you can see a structure like this. This is your glomus cell. So this again I seen as a question. So type 1 is a glomus cell, and type 2, this is supporting cells that are there. Okay, so this type 1 cell is your main cell. So oxygen, PCO2 and pH, these are things, the different variables that affect this. Of that, the most important is PO2. So when PO2 falls less than 90% saturation, okay, so that is when your oxygen sensitive potassium channels are no longer there in the picture. Okay, so normally we have your oxygen sensitive potassium channels, and potassium generally is potassium efflux from the cell. Intracellular potassium is much higher. So these channels are oxygen sensitive. When the PO2 falls less than 90%, then these oxygen sensitive potassium channels start shutting down. So when they are no longer active, more potassium builds up inside, more positive ions inside, means the threshold is reached, and ultimately there will be depolarization. Okay, so that will result in some whole sequence of activity which will ultimately help release some substances from these vesicles that are seen over here. Okay, so those substances that are released, your Ganong is giving it as dopamine, and which goes in the afferent nerve terminal, and because it is glossopharyngeal here, ninth, this is your carotid body. Okay, if it was aortic, it would have been vagus. So finally, this will go and act on the D2 receptors. But if you find a option of ATP, go for the ATP one. Okay, Guyton mentions that, Boron mentions that. So I read a lot of articles also. Generally, this is more, new and approved thing. The presence of ATP. Okay, dopamine is still there in other animals. Okay, so anyway, based on what question is coming, they won't put this in the same option. If dopamine is there, go for dopamine. Okay, if instead ATP is there, go for ATP. Okay, and also know that this carotid body has one of the highest blood flow per unit mass tissue in your body. Okay, so that is another thing. So what you have to understand is everything, every point that I mentioned in the previous slide, each of them were important. Each word I was saying was important question. Okay, so let's look at the next question. This is about the central chemoreceptors. Okay, what is the direct stimulus? What changes in blood is it sensitive to? So all these questions. So these chemosensitive areas which are there, which is in the medulla actually, and in the medulla ventrolateral. Okay, so this, what happens is the direct stimulation. Finally, what stimulates your chemoreceptors is H plus. Okay, so just imagine H plus from the blood coming. But because of the presence of blood-brain barrier, that does not happen. H plus from the blood cannot freely enter because of the blood-brain barrier and go and stimulate it. So some other form must be converting to H plus. So what is happening? It is your CO2. So CO2 which is there, that is hydrophobic. Okay, so the CO2 can easily cross the blood-brain barrier and it can form your carbonic acid and H plus HCO3 minus. Okay, and finally this happens. So two questions that come in the blood, it is your CO2 that your central chemoreceptor actually senses. But what actually stimulates it directly, that is your H plus. Okay, so in the blood, it is determinant of the PCO2, but what directly stimulates it ultimately is your H plus. And here also you can see this is the medulla and this is the ventral lateral parts of the medulla, and this is where this chemoreceptor is actually there. Okay, recently they also discovered regions in the medullary raphe also playing a role, but anyway, I put this because in various questions and options, this importance of understanding this is there. So this region where chemoreceptors are there, central chemoreceptors are there, is in the ventral lateral part of the medulla. Okay, so just understand that. All these extra things you don't need to know. So peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to hypoxia by oxygen sensitive potassium channels. We discussed that. Chemoreceptors are located in which area? So chemoreceptors are located in, when you talk about peripheral chemoreceptors, arch of aorta and bifurcation of carotid artery. So that is your carotid body and aortic body. And in the medulla we have the central chemoreceptors. So they have not specified which they were asking for. So the answer is going to be all of the above. The primary direct stimulus for excitation of central chemoreceptors. So primary direct stimulus is the H plus. Okay, so increase in H plus. Central chemoreceptors are most sensitive to following changes in blood. So in the blood, most sensitive is increase in PCO2.